10,000 years. That is how long the galaxy has spun through the void without his guiding hand. 10,000 years of decay, of regression, of entropy spreading through the arteries of an empire that once promised enlightenment, and now delivers only fire and faith. 10,000 years in which the dream of unity curdled into the nightmare of stagnation, where reason gave way to superstition and hope surrendered to hate. And then, against all probability, against the very laws that govern life and death, against the machinations of gods both dark and distant, he returned. Roboute Guilliman, the Avenging Son, the Lord of Ultramar, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, the Imperial Regent, the Lord Commander of the Imperium, a being engineered by the master of mankind himself to be the perfect synthesis of warrior and statesman, of conqueror and administrator. A demigod in ceramite and gold who now finds himself the reluctant king of a crumbling dominion, struggling to hold together an empire that has forgotten why it was built in the first place. This is his story, the tale of a son who became a legend who became a corpse, and a corpse who became a king. It is a story of triumph and tragedy, of vision and despair, of a being caught between the ideals of a bygone age and the brutal necessities of a present drowning in blood. This is the Space King of mankind, and the burden he bears for us all. Before we begin, perform your sacred duty to the Imperial algorithm. Like the video, subscribe to Obsidian Scriptorium, and consider it your mandatory lore tithe to the Administratum. Now, let the story begin. Before we can understand the king, we must understand the child. Before we can comprehend the weight of empire, we must trace the foundations upon which it was built. And so we begin, not on Terra, not in the laboratories of the Emperor's gene rights, but on a world called Macragge, in a forest where noblemen hunted and history changed forever. The world of Macragge sits in the galactic east, in a region that would eventually become known as Ultramar. During the Age of Strife, when the warp storms that followed the birth of Slaanesh cut humanity off from itself, Macragge survived where countless others perished. It was not a paradise, certainly not compared to what it would become, but it was stable. It maintained contact with neighbouring star systems. It preserved knowledge that elsewhere was lost to the darkness. Its people endured. Macragge was governed by a system of dual consuls, noble rulers who shared power in a manner reminiscent of ancient Rome. The culture itself bore the marks of Greco-Roman influence, with an emphasis on martial virtue, philosophical inquiry, and civic duty. The southern regions had developed into civilized city-states, while the north remained wild, a land called Illyrium populated by barbarians and outcasts who raided across the borders with impunity. Into this world fell the capsule. The Primarchs, those 20 sons of the Emperor, had been scattered across the galaxy by the Chaos Gods in a last desperate attempt to prevent the coming age of Imperial dominion. Each Primarch landed on a different world, their genetically engineered bodies adapting to their new environments, their minds shaped by the cultures that raised them. For Roboute Guilliman, fate chose Macragge. A group of noblemen hunting in the forest discovered the capsule. When they broke its seal, they found within a child of extraordinary appearance, surrounded by a nimbus of golden light. The child was brought before Consul Guilliman, one of Macragge's 2 consuls, a man of progressive ideals and popular support among the common people. Conor had dreamed of the Emperor, though he did not know the Master of Mankind by that name, and in his dream he had been led to Hera's Falls in the valley of Laponis. When he awoke, he rode to those falls, and there he found his destiny. Conor adopted the child and named him Roboute, which in the tongue of Macragge meant Great One. The consul appointed his most trusted aide, a woman named Tarasha Uton, to serve as the child's nurse and tutor. Tarasha would become one of the most important figures in Guilliman's early life, a surrogate mother in many ways, and one of the few beings who would ever speak to him without deference or fear. The young Roboute grew with impossible speed. his Primarch physiology accelerating his development far beyond that of normal humans. By the age of 10, measured in Terran years, he had mastered every subject that the wisest scholars of Macragge could teach him. His insights into history, philosophy, science, and law astonished his tutors. His memory was absolute, his ability to process information almost supernatural. He could extrapolate accurate conclusions from fragmentary data with a precision that seemed to border on prescience. But his greatest talent, the gift that would define his legend, was the art of war. On Macragge, military science was held in the highest regard, studied and refined with the same rigour that other cultures devoted to art or theology. Guilliman absorbed these teachings hungrily, not merely memorising tactics and strategies, but understanding the principles beneath them. He grasped the mathematics of logistics, the psychology of command, the geometry of fortification and assault. He saw warfare not as a series of disconnected engagements, but as a complex system with countless interdependent variables, each capable of being analysed, optimised, and controlled. When he reached his legal majority, Konor granted him command of an expeditionary force sent to pacify Illyrium, the barbarous northern lands that had defied civilized rule for generations. Guilliman led his army into those hostile mountains and, in a campaign that would become legendary in Macraggian annals, brought the entire region to heel. He did not simply defeat the Illyrian warlords, he dismantled their entire social structure, breaking the cycle of raiding and revenge that had perpetuated their resistance. He offered the conquered peoples not slavery or annihilation, but integration, a place within the system he was building. This would become the hallmark of Guilliman's approach to warfare. He did not merely conquer, he consolidated. He did not merely destroy, he rebuilt. Where other commanders might have razed Illyrium and sown its fields with salt, Guilliman transformed it into a productive part of Macragge's growing dominion. The warriors who had once raided the southern cities now served in Macragge's armies. The resources that had sustained their resistance now fueled Macragge's expansion. But even as Guilliman campaigned in the north, treachery brewed in the south. Gallan, the other consul of Macragge, belonged to a different faction than Konor. Where Konor represented progressive reform and popular governance, Gallan stood for the old aristocratic order, for the privileges of the noble houses and the concentration of power among the elite. The rise of Konor's superhuman son represented an existential threat to everything Gallan represented. Gallan struck while Guilliman was far from the capital. He organised a coup, using his influence among the conservative nobles to seize control of the government. Konor was cut off from his supporters, his loyalists hunted through the streets of Macragge Civitas. Guilliman received word of the betrayal and immediately turned his army south. He drove his forces at a punishing pace, racing against time to save his father. When he arrived at the capital, he found the city in chaos, Gallan's forces besieging Konor's final stronghold. Guilliman lifted the siege and fought his way to his father's side, but he arrived too late. Konor had been mortally wounded. With his dying breath, Konor told his adopted son of Gallan's treachery. The old consul passed into death, and Roboute Guilliman stood alone. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Guilliman crushed the rebellion with brutal efficiency, tracking down the conspirators and executing them for their crimes. But he did not simply replace one faction with another. He reorganised Macragge's entire social and political structure, implementing a true meritocracy where position and power were earned through ability and service rather than inherited through blood. He redistributed the lands that had been hoarded by the noble houses, breaking the economic foundation of aristocratic privilege. For 5 years, Roboute Guilliman ruled Macragge. Under his guidance, the world flourished as it never had before. He established trade routes with neighbouring systems, importing raw materials and exporting the products of Macragge's increasingly efficient industries. He reformed the military, creating a disciplined and well-equipped force capable of projecting power beyond the planet's atmosphere. He fostered education and scholarship, ensuring that the knowledge preserved through the Age of Strife would not merely survive but expand. When the Emperor of Mankind finally arrived at Macragge, he found not a primitive world in need of enlightenment, but a thriving civilization already building an interstellar domain. He found not a feral warrior in need of taming, but a sophisticated statesman who had already proven his capacity for governance. The Emperor was impressed, and the Emperor rarely allowed himself to be impressed. The meeting between the Emperor and Roboute Guilliman was one of the most significant moments in the history of the Imperium. Here was the master of mankind, the most powerful human being ever to exist, confronting one of his own creations, a son who had achieved more in his first decades of life than most civilizations achieve in centuries. The circumstances of their meeting were not entirely straightforward. The Emperor had actually heard of Guilliman some time before reaching Macragge. While his crusading forces were conquering the neighbouring world of Espandor, tales reached him of an extraordinary figure who ruled Macragge, a superhuman leader of impossible abilities. The Emperor recognised the description immediately. He had found one of his lost sons, but an unexpected warp storm threw the Emperor's ship off course, delaying his arrival at Macragge by several years. By the time he finally reached the world, Guilliman had been ruling for almost 5 years. The delay proved fortuitous in a sense, as it allowed the Emperor to see the full extent of what his son had accomplished. Here was proof of concept, a demonstration that the Primarchs could be more than just weapons of war. The Emperor gave Guilliman command of the 13th Space Marine Legion, the Ultramarines. He relocated the Legion's forward base to Macragge and granted Guilliman authority over an independent Crusade command in the Galactic East. From this point forward, the Ultramarines would not merely conquer worlds, they would build an empire within an empire. Guilliman threw himself into the work with characteristic thoroughness. He reorganised the Ultramarines from top to bottom, implementing a comprehensive plan that drew from the military doctrines of Macragge, the tactical data gathered from every other legion, an imperial military force, and his own insights into optimal military structure. The result was an elegantly organised force, meritocratic and flexible, capable of fighting with exceptional efficiency across every conceivable theatre of war. The Ultramarines fought according to a system Guilliman called theoretical and practical. For any given combat situation, the theoretical component involved analysing all available data to predict optimal outcomes, while the practical component involved implementing those predictions in real time and adjusting as circumstances evolved. It was a methodology that transformed warfare into something approaching a science, where intuition and experience were valuable but always subordinate to rigorous analysis. With the exception of the Lunar Wolves under Horus Lupercal, no legion conquered as many worlds or as quickly as the Ultramarines. More significantly, no legion left conquered worlds in such good condition. While other Primarchs might secure Imperial compliance and then move on, leaving behind devastated populations and shattered infrastructure, Guilliman insisted on establishing functional governments, working economies, and trained planetary defence forces before declaring a campaign complete. He saw no point in conquering a world only to have it collapse into anarchy the moment the Legion departed. This approach had practical benefits beyond mere stability. Worlds brought into compliance by the Ultramarines quickly became productive members of the Imperium, contributing resources and recruits to the war effort, rather than draining them. The 500 worlds of Ultramar, as Guilliman's growing domain came to be known, became the most efficient and productive region in the entire Imperium. They supplied the Ultramarines with a steady stream of new recruits and maintained the infrastructure necessary to equip and transport the largest Space Marine Legion in existence. Among his brother Primarchs, Guilliman occupied an interesting position. He was respected, certainly, admired for his accomplishments, and valued for his counsel. But he was not universally loved. His emphasis on efficiency and organisation struck some of his brothers as pedantic or arrogant. His willingness to question established practices and propose improvements was not always welcome. His very success, The sheer scale of what he had built in Ultramar provoked jealousy in some quarters. When the Emperor appointed Horus Lupercal as War Master, the supreme commander of all Imperial military forces, the reaction among the Primarchs varied. Some supported the appointment out of genuine affection for Horus. Others opposed it, believing themselves more worthy. Some accepted it cynically, recognising political necessity even if they disagreed with the choice. Guilliman, along with Rogel Dawn and Jahatai Khan, supported the appointment on rational grounds. They believed, based on careful analysis of their brother's capabilities and temperament, that Horus was genuinely the most qualified candidate. Horus, for his part, valued both Guilliman and Dawn as close advisors, recognising their strategic genius and relying on their counsel. Guilliman held 4 of his brothers in particularly high esteem. Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fist shared his appreciation for fortification and logistics, his understanding that defence was not a passive act but an active projection of force. Sanguinius of the Blood Angels possessed a nobility of spirit that transcended mere martial prowess, a genuine goodness that Guilliman found both admirable and somewhat mysterious. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves represented a different approach to warfare, savage where Guilliman was calculated, but no less effective for the difference. And the Khan of the White Scars, for all his apparent wildness, possessed a tactical subtlety that Guilliman recognised and respected. Other relationships were more complicated. Lorgar Aurelian of the Word-Bearers troubled Guilliman deeply. The Urizen's obsession with religious worship, his insistence that the Emperor was a god deserving of veneration, contradicted everything the Imperium was supposed to represent. The Imperial truth held that there were no gods, that superstition and religion were chains to be broken. Lorgar's devotion seemed a regression, a return to the darkness the Crusade was meant to dispel. The tension between the Word-Bearers and the rest of the Imperium came to a head on Kur, at a city called Monarchia. The Word-Bearers had built Monarchia as a monument to the Emperor's divinity, the most beautiful city on Kur, adorned with temples and shrines and statues celebrating their god-made flesh. The Emperor, disgusted by this perversion of the imperial truth, ordered the city destroyed, and he commanded Guilliman and the Ultramarines to carry out the destruction. The Ultramarines razed Monarchia to the ground. Then, in the ashes of that perfect city, the Emperor forced Lorgar and the entire Word-Bearers Legion to kneel before him, Guilliman and Malcador the Sigillite. It was a humiliation beyond anything the Word-Bearers had experienced, a shattering of their faith that would have consequences none present could have imagined. From that moment forward, Lorgar bore a hatred for Guilliman that transcended rational grudge. The Word-Bearers nursed their grievance through the decades that followed, waiting for an opportunity to repay humiliation with blood. That opportunity would come at a world called Calth. Before we venture into the darkness of the heresy, we must understand what Guilliman built during those golden decades of the Great Crusade. We must comprehend the scale and sophistication of Ultramar, the realm that made the Ultramarines more than just a Space Marine Legion. Ultramar, the 500 worlds, was unlike any other territory in the Imperium. Most Space Marine Legions maintained a homeworld, and perhaps a few recruiting worlds, scattered outposts in a galaxy dominated by the Administratum and the various branches of Imperial bureaucracy. The Ultramarines had something else entirely, a stellar empire, a miniature Imperium within the Imperium, governed according to Guilliman's principles and administered according to his designs. At its height during the Great Crusade, Ultramar consisted of over 500 human-settled star systems, all sworn to Guilliman's banner and integrated into a single political and economic entity. These worlds were divided into fiefdoms, each governed by a tetrarch appointed by the Primarch himself. The tetrarchs were typically Ultramarines captains or chapter masters, chosen for their administrative abilities as much as their martial prowess. They ruled their fiefdoms with considerable autonomy, but remained subordinate to Guilliman's overall direction. Macragge served as the heart of this empire, the capital from which Guilliman directed both military campaigns and civil governance. The planet had been transformed from the reasonably prosperous world of his youth into a marvel of organisation and efficiency. Its cities gleamed with ordered beauty, their architecture designed according to principles of aesthetic harmony and practical functionality. Its industries hummed with productivity, producing everything from agricultural goods to advanced military equipment. Its academies trained not just warriors but administrators, scientists, artists and philosophers. Calth was perhaps the second most important world in Ultramar, a manufacturing and shipbuilding hub whose output rivaled that of Macragge itself. The orbital shipyards of Calth produced vessels for the Ultramarines fleet and for merchant shipping throughout the realm. The planetary defence network protecting Calth was one of the most sophisticated in the Imperium, integrating over 900 orbital defence platforms with thousands of ground-based installations. Before the heresy, there was talk of Calth gaining its own fiefdom, recognition of its growing importance to Ultramar's economy. Eax was known as the Garden World, a planet of breathtaking natural beauty carefully preserved and enhanced by generations of stewardship. Its forests and meadows produced food for export throughout Ultramar, while its pristine environments served as places of rest and recuperation for warriors returning from the front lines. The people of Eax took pride in their world's beauty, maintaining it with almost religious devotion. Beyond these major worlds lay hundreds of others, each contributing its particular resources and talents to the whole. Mining worlds extracted the raw materials that fed Ultramar's industries. Agricultural worlds produced the food that fed its populations. Forge worlds manufactured the weapons and equipment that armed its soldiers, each piece interlocked with every other, forming a system that was more than the sum of its parts. This level of integration and coordination required something beyond mere military conquest. It required sophisticated infrastructure for communication, transportation, and administration. It required standardized systems of law, commerce, and governance. It required institutions capable of training competent administrators and maintaining consistent policies across hundreds of worlds. It required, in short, exactly the kind of systematic thinking at which Guilliman excelled. The people of Ultramar were not merely subjects, they were citizens in a meaningful sense. They possessed rights and protections under Guilliman's legal code. They could rise to positions of authority through merit rather than birth. They participated in the governance of their communities through various representative bodies. While Ultramar was no democracy in the modern sense, it was far more responsive to the needs and wishes of its people than most imperial domains. This relationship between rulers and ruled had practical benefits. The people of Ultramar were loyal to Guilliman not merely because he was powerful, but because his rule genuinely improved their lives. They fought for him not merely because they were commanded, but because they believed in what he represented. They provided recruits for the Ultramarines at rates that other legions could only envy, young men competing for the honour of serving their Primarch. The military structure of Ultramar reflected this integration of civilian and martial spheres. The Ultramar Auxilia, the mortal military forces of the realm, were not merely conscript levies but trained and equipped soldiers capable of operating alongside Space Marines. They possessed standardized equipment, consistent training, and coherent doctrine. They could hold ground, conduct defensive operations, and perform the countless support functions that freed the Ultramarines themselves for offensive action. Guilliman envisioned Ultramar as a model for what the entire Imperium could become. Once the Great Crusade ended, once the galaxy was united under the Emperor's rule, the principles that governed Ultramar could be extended throughout human space. The 500 worlds demonstrated that efficiency and civilization were not incompatible, that military might and cultural sophistication could coexist and reinforce each other. It was a beautiful dream. Like so many beautiful dreams of that era, it died in fire. The Horus heresy began far from Ultramar, in the poisoned swamps of Davin, where the War Master fell to chaos and rose as its champion. The treachery spread like a plague through the legions, corrupting half of the Primarchs and setting the galaxy ablaze. But for Guilliman and his Ultramarines, isolated in the galactic east, these catastrophic events remained unknown. The warp storms that accompanied the heresy disrupted communications across the Imperium. News travelled slowly and unreliably, when it travelled at all. Guilliman knew that something was wrong, sensed disturbances in the fabric of events, but he lacked concrete information about the nature or scope of the crisis. What he did know was that Horus, still recognised as War Master, had ordered the Ultramarines to muster at Calth in preparation for a joint campaign with the Word-Bearers against the Orcs of Gaslak. The order seemed reasonable on its face. The Ultramarines were the largest legion, and their participation would ensure the campaign's success. The cooperation with the Word-Bearers offered an opportunity to mend relations that had been strained since the destruction of Monarchia decades earlier. Guilliman harboured suspicions, as his mind always generated multiple hypotheses from available data. He recognised that the muster at Calth served Horus's political interests, allowing the newly appointed War Master to demonstrate his authority over even the most powerful of the legions. He wondered whether Lorgar had truly forgiven the humiliation of Monarchia, whether the Word-Bearers' participation in this campaign represented reconciliation, or something else entirely. But he obeyed the order. He was, after all, loyal to the Imperium, and Horus was the War Master. If he questioned every command, second-guessed every order, the entire structure of military hierarchy would collapse. Trust was the foundation upon which the Great Crusade had been built. That trust would cost him dearly. The Ultramarines assembled in force at Calth, 20 of their 22 chapters gathering above that industrial world. Approximately 200,000 Space Marines, one of the largest concentrations of Astartes in the history of the Great Crusade, along with the vast support apparatus of serfs, servitors, and auxiliary forces that sustained Legion operations. The orbital shipyards bustled with activity as vessels were prepared for the coming campaign. The Word-Bearers arrived as expected, their own fleet entering the Viridian system and taking position alongside the Ultramarines. There were the usual tensions that accompanied any interaction between the two legions, old grudges not quite forgotten, but also genuine efforts at cooperation. Guilliman met with Lorgar's representatives, discussed the coming campaign, reviewed logistical arrangements. Everything proceeded according to plan. Everything was a lie. The Word-Bearers had not come to Calth for a joint campaign. They had come to destroy the Ultramarines utterly, to eliminate in a single devastating strike the largest loyal legion, the greatest obstacle to Horus's advance on Terra. Lorgar had spent decades preparing for this moment, building his legion's strength, corrupting its warriors with the powers of chaos, all while maintaining the facade of loyal service. The destruction of Monarchia had merely confirmed what he had already come to believe, that the Emperor was a false god who denied the true powers of the universe. The attack came without warning. An ancient vessel called the Campanile, its systems corrupted by warp-tainted scrap code, hurtled toward the Calth orbital docks at a significant fraction of light speed. Its impact was cataclysmic, destroying dozens of ships and killing tens of thousands of personnel in the resulting cascade of explosions. The Ultramarines fleet, caught at anchor and unprepared, found itself fighting for survival before the battle had even properly begun. On the surface and in orbit, Word-Bearers turned their weapons on their Ultramarines' allies without hesitation or mercy. They had infiltrated the orbital defense network, corrupting its systems with demonic scrap code that turned its own weapons against its defenders. They had positioned their forces to maximize surprise and minimize the Ultramarines' ability to respond. They had come prepared not for war but for annihilation. Guilliman himself was aboard the Macragge's Honour, his flagship, when the treachery was revealed. He found himself fighting in the void near the shattered hull of his vessel, battling Word-Bearers attempting to board in the aftermath of the initial strike. For nearly 12 hours the Primarch fought without a helmet in near-vacuum conditions, punching Chaos Marines to death with his bare hands, refusing to acknowledge the impossibility of his circumstances. It was a display of superhuman endurance that would have killed any lesser being 1,000 times over. When Corferon, one of Lorgar's most trusted captains, attempted to corrupt Guilliman with a chaos-tainted blade similar to the one that had felled Horus, the Primarch responded with characteristic directness. He tore out one of Corferon's hearts and hurled the Dark Cardinal across the chamber. The powers of chaos that had seduced Horus found no purchase in Guilliman's rational mind. The battle raged across Calth for days, weeks, months. The Ultramarines, once they recovered from the initial shock, fought back with a fury that startled even the word-bearers. Guilliman directed the defence with cold precision, transforming chaos into order, coordinating counterattacks that prevented the traitors from achieving their objective of total annihilation. The vaunted theoretical and practical methodology proved its worth, allowing the Ultramarines to adapt to an unprecedented situation and respond with devastating effectiveness. But even as the Ultramarines fought on the surface and in orbit, Erebus and the Word-Bearers' chaplains performed darker work. They conducted rituals of unimaginable evil, blood sacrifices that channeled the power of chaos into the fabric of reality itself. The true purpose of the Calth attack was not merely military, it was mystical. The Word-Bearers were summoning a warp storm, a vast disturbance in the Imperium that would cut Ultramar off from the rest of the galaxy and prevent the Ultramarines from reinforcing Terra. The Ruin Storm, as it came to be known, would divide the galaxy in two. For years, decades, the Loyalist forces trapped on the wrong side of that storm would struggle to find a path to Terra, to join the battle for the Emperor's life. The shadow of Calth would stretch across the entire heresy. More immediately, the assault devastated Calth itself. The Word-Bearers corrupted Viridian, Calth's sun, bombarding it with weapons that poisoned its stellar core. The star began to emit lethal radiation that scoured Calth's surface, destroying its atmosphere and rendering its once verdant landscapes into irradiated wastelands. The population was forced underground, into vast subterranean cities that would shelter them from the killing light above. The Battle of Calth ended in something like a victory for the Ultramarines. The Word-Bearers were ultimately driven from the system, their attempt at annihilation thwarted by Ultramarines' determination and Guilliman's tactical genius. But the cost was catastrophic. More than 100,000 Ultramarines died at Calth, along with 500,000 or more mortal auxiliaries. The orbital shipyards were destroyed, the fleet crippled, the industrial capacity of one of Ultramar's most important worlds eliminated in hours, and the ruin storm sealed them in. The road to Terra was closed. The betrayal at Calth was only the beginning. Even as Guilliman consolidated his forces and drove the remaining Word-Bearers from the Viridian system, a greater horror descended upon Ultramar. The Shadow Crusade had begun. Lorgar did not remain at Calth. The Word-Bearers' Primarch had been informed by the demon Kairos Fate-Weaver, through some manipulation of fate or foresight, that killing Guilliman at Calth would actually harm the traitor's cause. The implications of this prophecy remain unclear. Speculation suggests that Guilliman's survival was somehow necessary for events that would ultimately benefit Chaos, or that his death at that moment would have catalyzed a response from the Emperor that the traitors could not have withstood. Regardless, Lorgar departed shortly after the battle began, leaving the actual fighting to his subordinates. The Word-Bearers' Primarch instead joined forces with Angron of the World Eaters, leading a combined fleet of the two traitor legions on a campaign of destruction through Ultramar. For months they ravaged the 500 worlds, destroying everything they could reach, murdering populations and fueling the ruin storm with blood and terror. 26 worlds fell to the Shadow Crusade before Guilliman could bring his forces to bear. The Ultramarines pursued, but they were divided, their forces scattered by the initial attack at Calth and the need to defend multiple fronts simultaneously. Guilliman himself tracked the traitors to Nuceria, Angron's homeworld, where the World Eater's Primarch had returned to take vengeance on the people who had once enslaved him. There, Guilliman confronted both Lorgar and Angron in personal combat, it did not go well. Guilliman had never been the most fearsome of the Primarchs in individual combat. His genius lay in strategy and organisation, not in single combat. Lorgar, who had spent decades hardening himself for war and opening himself to chaos, proved surprisingly capable. And when Angron joined the fight, the outcome was inevitable. The World Eater's Primarch battered Guilliman with a furious assault, driving him to the ground and raising his chain axes for the killing blow. Only the intervention of the Ultramarines themselves saved their Primarch. Captain Ventanus and a company of Space Marines threw themselves at Angron, buying precious seconds for Guilliman to be retrieved. The Ultramarines escaped with their wounded Primarch, but the Shadow Crusade continued. It was during this dark period that Guilliman made perhaps the most controversial decision of his life. Cut off from Terra by the Ruin Storm, uncertain whether the Emperor still lived, watching his own realm burn while unable to render aid to the heart of the Imperium, the Primarch established a contingency. He created the Imperium Secundus. The concept was straightforward enough in theory. If Terra had fallen, if the Emperor was dead, then the Imperium would need a new centre of power to coordinate the remaining Loyalist forces. Better to establish that centre in advance, in a stable region with the resources and organisation to sustain it, than to allow the survivors to fracture into squabbling factions fighting over the corpse of their father's dream. Guilliman chose Macragge as the capital of this secondary Imperium. He activated the Pharos, an ancient Xenos device capable of piercing the Ruin Storm and serving as a beacon for lost ships seeking safe harbour. Other Loyalists began arriving, guided through the storm by the Pharos' light. Sanguinius of the Blood Angels came, his legion having narrowly escaped a trap set by the traitors at Cygnus. Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels arrived later, though his motives remained as inscrutable as ever. The question of who would rule the Imperium Secundus proved complicated. Guilliman himself refused to take the title of Emperor, unwilling to appear as vain and power-hungry as Horus had become. He initially suggested that the Lion, as the oldest Primarch present, should take the position, though he distrusted the Dark Angel's Primarch's secretive nature. Eventually, the three Primarchs agreed that Sanguinius should be named Emperor of the Imperium Secundus. The choice made a certain sense. Sanguinius possessed a charisma and nobility that transcended mere martial prowess. He was beloved by Space Marines and mortals alike, a figure of genuine goodness in an age that seemed to offer nothing but darkness. He radiated something spiritual, an aura of the divine that Guilliman's rational mind could not quite explain but could not deny. If anyone could rally the survivors of the Imperium to a new banner, it was the Angel. But Sanguinius was not the Emperor. The Imperium Secundus was not the true Imperium. And as time passed, as news filtered through the storm suggesting that Terra still held, that the Emperor still lived, the entire enterprise began to seem more questionable. Had Guilliman overstepped? Had he created a precedent that could be used to justify future secessions and usurpations? Was the Imperium Secundus a necessary contingency or an act of hubris? The Primarchs themselves grew increasingly uncertain. The Lion, in particular, harboured doubts about the legitimacy of what they had created. The tension between the Dark Angel's Primarch and his brothers grew acute, culminating in moments of near violence that threatened to shatter their alliance entirely. When the Ruin Storm finally weakened enough to permit passage, when a path to Terra became visible at last, the Primarchs faced a choice. They could continue building their secondary empire, consolidating their position against whatever emerged from the chaos at the galaxy's heart. Or they could dissolve the Imperium Secundus and race to their father's defence, accepting whatever judgment he might render for their presumption. Guilliman chose loyalty. He disbanded the Imperium Secundus, withdrew his claim to the secondary throne, and turned his forces toward Terra. The three Primarchs departed together, seeking a route through the dissipating storm, determined to reach the Emperor in time to make a difference. They would not arrive in time to save him. The Blood Angels alone would reach the siege of Terra while it still raged. Sanguinius dying in combat with Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Guilliman and the Lion arrived too late, finding a shattered palace and a dying emperor who had already been interred upon the Golden Throne. The dream of the Great Crusade was over. A new age, darker and more terrible than anything that had come before, was about to begin. In the aftermath of the heresy, the Imperium lay in ruins. Fully half of the Space Marine legions had turned traitor. The Emperor was entombed upon the Golden Throne, neither truly alive nor truly dead, his voice silenced and his plans abandoned. The War Master was dead, but his followers had retreated to the Eye of Terror, still a potent threat that would return again and again to plague the survivors. The Ultramarines emerged from the heresy as the largest remaining loyal legion. Their losses at Calth and in the battles that followed had been catastrophic, but the sheer size of the legion meant that even with those losses, they still possessed more fighting strength than any other loyalist force. Guilliman found himself in a position of unprecedented authority, the most powerful military leader in an Imperium that had lost its emperor. He assumed the title of Lord Commander of the Imperium, effectively becoming the supreme military and political authority beneath the still silent emperor. For years he led the Ultramarines and coordinated the other loyalist forces in what became known as the Great Scouring, a systematic campaign to reclaim worlds that had fallen to the traitors and purge the remaining heretics from Imperial space. The Scouring was brutal, exhausting work. The traitor legions might have retreated to the Eye, but they left behind countless mortal followers, cultists, and corrupted populations. Systems that had been loyal before the heresy now worshipped the dark gods. Worlds that had been civilized had descended into barbarism. The infrastructure of the Imperium, already strained by the demands of the Crusade, had been shattered by years of civil war. Guilliman directed the reconstruction with the same systematic approach he had brought to the conquest of Ultramar. He reorganized the imperial bureaucracy, creating new institutions and procedures to replace those that had failed or been corrupted. He established the framework for what would become the Adeptus Terra, the sprawling administrative apparatus that would govern the Imperium in the Emperor's absence. He worked tirelessly, obsessively, driving himself and those around him to their limits and beyond. But his most significant and controversial achievement during this period was the creation of the Codex Astartes. The Horus heresy had demonstrated with horrifying clarity the danger of concentrating too much military power in any single individual. The legions had been weapons of conquest, yes, but they had also been weapons of destruction when turned against their own people. A single Primarch commanding tens of thousands of Space Marines could bring entire sectors to ruin, as Horus and his brothers had proven. Guilliman's solution was division. The Codex Astartes mandated that the Space Marine legions be broken down into smaller units called chapters, each comprising approximately 1,000 battle brothers. These chapters would be independent of one another, each with its own command structure, recruiting world and traditions. No single individual, not even a Primarch, would command more than 1,000 Space Marines. The Codex went far beyond mere organizational structure. It was a comprehensive treatise on military doctrine, tactical methodology, and moral philosophy. It specified squad designations and their associated equipment. It detailed the proper tactics for every conceivable battlefield situation. It provided guidance on leadership, discipline, and the spiritual duties of the Space Marines. It became, in effect, the Bible of the Adeptus Astartes. Not everyone accepted the Codex's dictates. Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists initially refused to break his legion, seeing the demand as an insult to warriors who had shed their blood defending Terra itself. The confrontation between Dawn and Guilliman nearly reignited civil war, with other legions taking sides. Leman Russ stood with Dawn, while Jagatai Khan and Corvus Corax supported Guilliman. The crisis was eventually resolved when Dawn submitted to the Emperor's will, spending 7 days meditating in the Pain Glove, a torture device the Imperial Fists used for penance and focus. He emerged with a new understanding. The Legion must serve the Emperor who was, not the Emperor who had been. The old order was gone. The new order demanded sacrifice. The Space Wolves, characteristically, never fully accepted the Codex. To this day, they organise themselves into great companies rather than the standardised structure specified by Guilliman's work. Other chapters have diverged in various ways, adapting the Codex's guidelines to their own circumstances and traditions. But the fundamental principle, the limitation of chapter strength to approximately 1,000 battle brothers, has been maintained. No chapter has been permitted to grow to Legion size again. Was the Codex Astartes a mistake? The question has been debated for 10 millennia. Critics argue that dividing the legions weakened the Imperium's military power at the very moment when strength was most needed. The scattered chapters, they claim, have struggled against threats that a unified legion could have crushed. The loss of institutional knowledge and the fragmentation of shared traditions have diminished the Space Marines as a whole. Defenders of the Codex point to its fundamental success. There has never been another Horus. No chapter master has had the power to threaten the Imperium the way the War Master did. When chapters have turned traitor, as some have, the damage has been limited. The system has contained threats that might otherwise have metastasized into existential crises. Guilliman himself, after his resurrection in the 41st millennium, has acknowledged that the Codex was imperfect. He has revised and updated it, eliminating restrictions that proved counterproductive and incorporating new doctrines to address the changed circumstances of the galaxy. He has stated that the Codex was always meant to be a guide, not a straitjacket, and that those chapters who treated his words as holy writ missed the point entirely. But in the aftermath of the heresy, with treachery fresh in everyone's memory and the stench of betrayal still hanging over the Imperium, the Codex's caution seemed justified. Better to accept some loss of efficiency than to risk another civil war. Better to constrain power than to see it perverted again. The Great Scouring eventually wound down, as such things do. The traitors were driven into the Eye of Terror, their mortal followers scattered or destroyed, their corrupted worlds cleansed or quarantined. The Imperium remained, wounded but functional, its borders stabilised if not secure. A new equilibrium, grim and fragile but enduring, settled over human space. Guilliman continued his work, administering the Imperium and commanding his legion, now reduced to chapter strength in accordance with the Codex. He fought in countless campaigns, dealt with innumerable administrative crises, made decisions that affected billions of lives. He did what needed to be done, as he always had. In 121 M31, approximately 1 century after the end of the heresy, Guilliman led a campaign against the Emperor's Children Traitor Legion. The Third Legion had been transformed by their devotion to Slaanesh, becoming hedonistic predators who existed only for sensation and experience. Their Primarch, Fulgrim, had ascended to demonhood, transformed by the Prince of Pleasure into a serpentine monstrosity of impossible beauty and terrible power. The two Primarchs met at the Battle of Thessala. It was not the first time Guilliman had faced a demonic Primarch. He had battled the forces of chaos throughout the Scouring and beyond. But Fulgrim was different. The demon Primarch's power had been magnified by his devotion to Slaanesh, his abilities enhanced beyond anything a mortal could withstand. The duel was brief and decisive. Fulgrim, wielding blades tainted with the power of chaos, struck Guilliman across the throat. The wound was mortal, the poison carried by the blade more terrible than any natural toxin. Even a Primarch's superhuman physiology could not overcome the corruption flowing through Guilliman's system. His sons retrieved him from the battlefield, carrying their dying father to safety as the campaign continued around them. The apothecaries and tech marines examined him, seeking some way to save his life, but the wound was beyond their skill to heal. The poison was magical as well as physical, a curse as much as a toxin. In desperation, they turned to the one technology that might preserve him: stasis. A stasis field could freeze time itself around a subject, halting all physical and biological processes, suspending the subject in an eternal moment between life and death. If Guilliman could not be healed, he could at least be preserved, held in suspended animation until some future time when a cure might be found. They constructed a throne for him, an ornate seat of marble and gold set within the Temple of Correction on Macragge. They placed him upon it, arranged his limbs and features with reverent care, and activated the stasis field. Roboute Guilliman, Lord of Ultramar, Lord Commander of the Imperium, author of the Codex Astartes, Primarch of the Ultramarines, entered his long sleep. For 10,000 years he remained there, motionless, silent, frozen on the edge of death. The Imperium continued without him. Other figures rose to prominence, the High Lords of Terror assuming collective authority in the Emperor's name. The Administratum grew and expanded, becoming the vast bureaucratic apparatus that would govern humanity through the long millennia. Wars were fought and won and lost. Planets burned and flourished and burned again. The grim darkness of the far future settled over the galaxy like a shroud. Pilgrims came to the Temple of Correction, travelling across the galaxy to see the body of a Primarch, a blessed son of the Emperor himself. They gazed upon his frozen features and prayed for his return, for the salvation they believed he would bring. Some claimed to see his wounds slowly healing, the damage inflicted by Fulgrim gradually mending even within the stasis field. The Ultramarines maintained that such claims were impossible, that nothing could change within an activated stasis field, but the Pilgrims believed what they wished to believe, and perhaps they were right to believe. Perhaps something impossible was happening within that frozen moment. Perhaps forces beyond mortal comprehension were at work, preparing for a resurrection that would shake the foundations of the galaxy. The 41st millennium was not kind to the Imperium of man. It was a time of endings, of calamities so vast that they threatened to swallow humanity entirely. The Eye of Terror vomited forth black, crusade after black crusade, each one striking deeper into Imperial space than the last. Tyrannid hive fleets consumed entire sectors. Orc ways burned across the stars. The Tau expanded their empire in the galactic east, and darker things stirred in places better left unnamed. Through it all, the Emperor sat upon his golden throne, fed by the daily sacrifice of thousands of psychers, his power sustaining the Astronomicon, and keeping closed the portal to the webway that would otherwise drown terror in demons. The master of humanity had become its prisoner, bound to his failing machine, unable to speak or act directly in the affairs of his realm. And then came the 13th Black Crusade. Abaddon the Despoiler, Warmaster of Chaos, chosen successor to Horus himself, had launched 12 Black Crusades against the Imperium over the millennia. Each had been defeated, turned back by the defenders of the Cadian Gate, that crucial strategic choke point that guarded the approach from the Eye of Terror. Cadia had held. Always Cadia had held. This time was different. Abaddon committed forces of unprecedented size to the assault, calling upon the full might of the Chaos Legions and their demonic allies. He brought weapons of terrible power, including Blackstone fortresses that could channel the fury of the warp itself. He came not merely to raid or to test the defenders, but to break Cadia forever. The defenders fought with desperate courage. Space Marines from dozens of chapters reinforced the Cadian shock troops, elite regiments who had held the gate for 10,000 years. St. Celestine herself, the living saint, manifest avatar of the Emperor's will, descended to fight at their side. Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax of the Order Hereticus, newly freed from imprisonment by the Necrons, brought her formidable psychic powers to bear. But it was not enough. Abaddon threw one of the Blackstone fortresses at Cadia itself, using the massive structure as a world-killing projectile. The impact shattered the planet, destroying the ancient pylons that had held back the warp for millennia. The Eye of Terror, no longer contained, expanded catastrophically, tearing a wound across the galaxy that became known as the Great Rift. The Cicatrix Maledictum, as it was called in High Gothic, divided the Imperium in two. The northern half, cut off from the light of the Astronomicon, became the Imperium Nearless, a realm of darkness and despair where worlds had to survive, alone against horrors beyond counting. The southern half retained connection to Terra but faced its own trials, besieged by the forces of chaos pouring through the newly opened wound in reality. It was, many believed, the end. The death of the Imperium, the fall of humanity. But hope came from an unexpected direction. Throughout the millennia of Guilliman's slumber, an Archmagos of the Adeptus Mechanicus, named Belisarius Cawl, had been working in secret. Acting on orders given 10,000 years before, Cawl had devoted himself to a project of staggering ambition, the improvement and perfection of the Space Marines themselves. He had developed new implants, new procedures, new technologies that could create a new breed of Astartes, larger and stronger than the originals, with additional organs and enhanced capabilities. These Primaris Space Marines, as they came to be known, represented the next step in the Emperor's great work. And Cawl had not merely developed the technology, he had created an army. Hundreds of thousands of Primaris Marines waited in stasis vaults deep beneath the surface of Mars, ready to be awakened when the need arose. The need had arisen. Cawl also possessed something else, the Armour of Fate, a suit of power armour designed specifically to heal the wounds that had laid Guilliman low. The armour incorporated technologies both Imperial and Xenos, including innovations that pushed the boundaries of Mechanicus dogma. It could not cure the Primarch outright, but it could sustain him, keeping the poison at bay while his superhuman physiology gradually recovered. The survivors of Cadia's fall, guided by Eldar Farseers of the mysterious Inari faction, made their way to Macragge. They carried Cawl and his precious armour through the storm-racked warp, evading the pursuit of Chaos forces, seeking the one hope that might save the Imperium from annihilation. The resurrection was not a simple matter. Cawl's technology could heal the physical wounds, but Fulgrim's blade had done more than physical damage. The corruption it carried had touched Guilliman's soul, dragging him toward death across dimensions beyond the material. Healing the body would mean nothing if the soul remained lost. This is where the Inari played their crucial role. Ivrain, High Priestess of Inerd, the nascent elder god of the dead, possessed powers that could touch the spiritual realm. She used those powers on Guilliman, calling his soul back from wherever it had wandered, binding it once more to his healing body. The resurrection took place in the midst of battle. Chaos forces had assaulted Macragge itself, seeking to prevent Guilliman's return. The Black Legion struck at the fortress of Hera, the heart of the Ultramarines, determined to destroy the Primarch before he could rise. They very nearly succeeded. But Guilliman woke, and when he woke angry. The Primarch rose from his throne, clad in the armour of fate, armed with the Emperor's sword that had been brought from Terra for this moment. He strode into battle against the forces that had invaded his home, the blade burning with psychic fire that could destroy demons permanently, erasing them from existence rather than merely banishing them. The Black Legion broke against him, their assault transformed into a rout in moments. Roboute Guilliman had returned. After 10,000 years of silence, the Lord of Ultramar lived once more. The resurrection was only the beginning. Guilliman could not simply remain on Macragge, defending his home while the Imperium crumbled around him. He needed to reach Terra to consult with the Emperor if possible, to take command of the broader war effort. The journey would not be easy. The Great Rift had transformed interstellar travel into a nightmare. Warp routes that had been stable for millennia were now disrupted or destroyed entirely. Demon incursions erupted seemingly at random. The light of the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided ships through the Immaterium, flickered and failed across vast swaths of the galaxy. Guilliman gathered what forces he could and set out on what became known as the Terran Crusade. The fleet included Ultramarines, of course, but also elements from other chapters, Imperial Guard regiments, Mechanicus forces, and the surviving heroes of the Cadian campaign. The Inari accompanied them for a time, their alliance with the Imperium fragile but necessary. The journey was marked by constant battle. Chaos forces harried the fleet at every opportunity, seeking to destroy Guilliman before he could reach Terra. The Crusade fought through the Maelstrom, a massive warp storm that had existed since the Heresy, and there they faced a trap set by Kairos Fateweaver and the Red Corsairs. Guilliman himself was captured, imprisoned in crystalline chains forged from his own doubts and fears. The demon's torments were psychological as much as physical, bombarding the Primarch with visions of Terra's fall, the Emperor's death, the destruction of everything he had fought to preserve. The voices of chaos whispered that if he only stopped fighting, if he only accepted his imprisonment, the terrible futures he saw might be averted. The Primarch refused. His will, forged in the fires of 10,000 years of war and loss, proved stronger than the demon's deceptions. With the help of unlikely allies, including the fallen angel known as Cypher and the Harlequin Shadowseer Silandri Veilwalker, Guilliman escaped his prison and continued his journey. The Crusade eventually reached Luna, Earth's moon, where they faced another obstacle. Magnus the Red, demon Primarch of the Thousand Suns, had laid a trap. The Crimson King sought to prevent his brother from reaching Terra, to keep the Primarch from the Emperor's side. The battle that followed was devastating, fought across the surface of Luna and in the skies above. Guilliman prevailed. He broke Magnus's assault, drove the Thousand Suns back, and descended to Terra at last. The journey that had seemed impossible was complete. What followed next remains shrouded in mystery. Guilliman entered the throne room of the Imperial Palace, accompanied only by the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, Trajan Valoris. He approached the Golden Throne, that vast and terrible machine that sustained the Emperor's withered form. He stood before his father for the first time in 10 millennia, and the Emperor awoke. What passed between them, what words were exchanged or impressions conveyed, has never been fully revealed. Guilliman has spoken of it rarely, and always with reluctance. He has said that the experience was surreal, almost incomprehensible, that the Emperor's mind had become something vast and inhuman after 10,000 years upon the throne. The Primarch has suggested that the Emperor no longer saw him as a son, perhaps no longer saw him as anything more than a tool to be used in humanity's defence. Whether this perception was accurate, a product of the Emperor's transformed state, or merely Guilliman's own interpretation of an experience beyond mortal comprehension, remains unclear. What is certain is that Guilliman emerged from the throne room changed. He had entered with questions and doubts. He left with a renewed sense of purpose, albeit one tinged with something darker. He had sought his father's approval, and instead found something that defied easy categorization. He had hoped for reunion, and instead experienced something closer to instruction. The Imperial Regent emerged from the audience with the Emperor and summoned the High Lords of Terror. He declared that the Imperium would be reorganized and rearmed under his leadership to confront the coming threat of chaos. He took upon himself once more the title of Lord Commander of the Imperium, supreme military authority over all Imperial forces. Some of the High Lords objected. The political establishment that had grown up during the Emperor's silence did not welcome a new authority, especially one with the power of a Primarch. The ecclesiarchy worried about a return to the imperial truth that Guilliman had championed 10,000 years ago. The Inquisition wondered whether even a Primarch could be trusted with such power. But Guilliman had the Emperor's blessing, such as it was, and the support of the Adeptus Custodes. More importantly, he had demonstrated results. The crusade that brought him to Terra had proven his capabilities. The situation demanded strong leadership. The High Lords, however, reluctantly accepted his authority. The Indomitus Crusade was about to begin. The Indomitus Crusade represented the largest military mobilization the Imperium had undertaken since the Great Crusade 10,000 years before. Guilliman gathered forces from across the Imperium, calling upon Space Marine chapters, Astra Militarum regiments, Mechanicus forces, Titan legions, Imperial Navy fleets, the Sisters of Battle, the Adeptus Custodes, and the Sisters of Silence. He supplemented these traditional forces with the newly awakened Primaris Space Marines, deploying them both as reinforcements for existing chapters and as the foundation for entirely new ones. The Crusade's organisation reflected Guilliman's characteristic attention to logistics and structure. He divided the forces into multiple fleets, each assigned to a specific region and objective. Fleet Primus, under his personal command, would spearhead the advance. Other fleets would follow, consolidating gains and establishing permanent defences. Torchbearer task forces, specialised units carrying the technology and expertise needed to create Primaris Marines, would seek out isolated chapters and bring them the Emperor's gifts. Even before the Crusade proper began, Guilliman had to defend Terra itself. The forces of Khorne, seizing upon the chaos surrounding the Great Rift's birth, launched an assault on humanity's homeworld. The Second Battle of Lion's Gate saw demons fighting in the streets of the Imperial Palace, the first such incursion since the Siege of Terra itself. Guilliman led the counter-attack personally, wielding the Emperor's sword against the Blood God's servants. The Crusade departed from the Sol system in stages, with Fleet Tertius actually leaving first due to emerging threats that could not wait. Fleet Primus followed, bearing Guilliman himself and the largest concentration of Primaris Marines. Archimagos Kal accompanied the Primarch aboard the massive vessel Tsar Quaesitor, continuing to produce and awaken new Primaris Marines as the Crusade advanced. The early campaigns were desperate affairs. The Great Rift had unleashed horrors across the galaxy, and the Crusade found itself fighting to save worlds rather than conquer them. On some planets they arrived in time to turn the tide. On others they arrived too late, and could only ensure vengeance. On a few, no hope remained, and Guilliman ordered exterminatus, the destruction of entire worlds to deny them to the enemy. As the Crusade worked its way outward from Terra, word of the Primarch's return spread throughout the Imperium. To billions of suffering humans, the news seemed nothing short of miraculous. Here was proof that the Emperor had not abandoned them, that hope remained even in the darkest hour. The Primarch's mere presence reinvigorated the Imperium's morale in ways that no military victory could have matched. Guilliman dispatched torchbearer task forces to chapters throughout the galaxy, bringing Primaris Marines as reinforcements and the technology needed to create more. Some chapters accepted these gifts readily, recognizing the need for new weapons in a new age. Others were more suspicious, questioning whether these new warriors were truly Space Marines or something else entirely. A few refused outright, preferring to fight and die as they always had rather than embrace innovation. The Blood Angels exemplified the Crusade's impact. Hive Fleet Leviathan had descended upon their homeworld of Baal, threatening to destroy the chapter and all its successors in a single devastating assault. The defenders fought with characteristic ferocity, but the outcome seemed inevitable. Then Guilliman arrived, leading Fleet Primus into the battle at the crucial moment, shattering the Tyrannid offensive and saving the sons of Sanguinius from extinction. Similar scenes played out across the galaxy. The Crusade brought relief to besieged worlds, reinforcements to depleted chapters, and hope to populations that had begun to despair. For 12 years by the original imperial calendar, the Indomitus Crusade pushed outward from Terra, stabilizing the Imperium Sanctus and laying the groundwork for future reconquest. But no crusade could last forever. At the Battle of Raukos, Guilliman declared the first phase of the Indomitus Crusade complete. He held a great triumphal review, dispersing the remaining military elements to reinforce various strategic locations throughout the Imperium. New chapters of Primaris Marines were assigned to worlds that needed permanent defenders, and then the Primarch received word from Ultramar. The realm he had built and loved was under attack. The forces of Nurgle had not been idle during the upheavals surrounding the Great Rift's birth. The Plague God, ever patient, had been nurturing a grand design in the galactic east. 3 star systems to the north of Ultramar had been corrupted by Nurgle's influence, transformed into the Scourge Stars, staging grounds for an invasion of Guilliman's own domain. The architects of this plague were formidable. Mortarion, demon Primarch of the Death Guard, had emerged from the Eye of Terror to lead the assault personally. The being who had once been Guilliman's brother now served Nurgle with devotion, his mortal form transformed into something vast and terrible, wreathed in pestilent fumes and radiating disease. Kugath the Plague Father, one of Nurgle's greatest greater demons, commanded demonic legions. Typhus, first captain of the Death Guard and herald of the Plague God, led his own devastating campaigns through Ultramar's outer systems. The invasion had begun while Guilliman was still conducting the Indomitus Crusade. The Ultramarines and their allies fought desperately to hold the line, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Mortarion's forces did not merely conquer, they corrupted. Worlds that fell to the Death Guard were transformed into gardens of decay, their populations twisted into plague zombies or worse. When Guilliman returned to Ultramar, he found his realm bleeding. The garden world of Eax had been corrupted beyond recognition, its famous beauty transformed into a landscape of rot and misery. The Forge world of Conor was under siege. World after world reported outbreaks of supernatural plagues that defied all treatment. The Primarch took command personally, applying his tactical genius to halt the Nurglite advance. He launched the Spear of Espandor counteroffensive, a brilliant series of strikes that cut off the Death Guard's supply lines and isolated their forward elements. He fought alongside his Ultramarines and their Primaris brothers, wielding the Emperor's sword against demonic entities that would have destroyed lesser warriors. The campaign brought Guilliman into direct confrontation with Mortarion for the first time in 10 millennia. The 2 brothers, transformed in different ways by the ages that had passed, faced each other on the battlefield of Parmenio. Mortarion sought to infect Guilliman with a supernatural plague called the Godblight, a disease engineered specifically to kill a Primarch. Their duel was a clash of philosophies as much as weapons. Mortarion embodied despair, the acceptance of entropy and decay as the fundamental truth of existence. Guilliman represented defiance, the insistence that meaning and purpose could be maintained even in the face of inevitable dissolution. Neither could easily overcome the other. They were matched in power if not in nature. The resolution came through intervention that neither brother had anticipated. The Emperor himself, acting through mechanisms unknown, struck at Mortarion through Guilliman. A moment of divine power, channeled through the Primarch's body, drove back the Plague Father's champion. Mortarion retreated, forced to acknowledge defeat, at least for the moment. The Plague Wars ended with Ultramar wounded but intact. The corruption spread by the Death Guard would take years to fully cleanse, and some scars would never heal entirely. But the realm had survived. Guilliman had defended his creation against one of the Imperium's most terrible enemies. In the aftermath, the Primarch reorganized Ultramar's defences. He reinstated the Tetrarchy system, appointing trusted commanders to govern the 4 sectors of his realm. He assigned 10 chapters of Space Marines to permanent defence of the 500 worlds, ensuring that Ultramar would never again be caught unprepared. He launched the Vengeance campaigns, offensive operations against the Scourge Stars that would keep the enemy off balance and prevent another invasion. But even as he rebuilt and fortified his home, Guilliman knew that the war was far from over. The Great Rift continued to vomit forth horrors. The Imperium Nihilus remained cut off and suffering. Countless other threats, from Tyranids to Necrons to Orcs to the Tau, pressed against humanity's borders. The burden of kingship permitted no rest. To truly understand Roboute Guilliman, we must venture beyond the chronicle of battles and campaigns, beyond the statistics of worlds conquered and enemies defeated. We must attempt, however imperfectly, to comprehend the mind that dwells within that superhuman frame. Guilliman is, fundamentally, a rationalist. His approach to every problem, military or otherwise, begins with analysis. He gathers data, identifies patterns, formulates hypotheses, and tests conclusions against evidence. The theoretical and practical methodology that defines Ultramarines' doctrine is merely the martial expression of a broader cognitive framework, an insistence that reason and evidence should guide all action. This rationalism made the Imperium of the 41st millennium profoundly disturbing to him. He returned from stasis to find an empire dominated by superstition and religious dogma, where the emperor he had known as a fierce advocate for scientific truth was now worshipped as a god. The Imperial Creed, with its saints and miracles and holy relics, represented everything his father had once opposed. The famous quote attributed to Guilliman captures his despair with devastating clarity. He's said to have wondered why he still lived. What more could be wanted from him after he had given everything? He looked upon the Imperium and saw not the enlightened civilization his father had planned, but a bloated, rotting carcass driven by fear, hate, and ignorance. He questioned whether it would have been better for all of them to have burned in the fires of Horus's ambition than to have lived to see this. That despair, though profound, did not paralyze him. Guilliman is, if nothing else, pragmatic. He recognized that lamenting the past accomplished nothing. The Imperium as it existed, however flawed, was the only bulwark humanity possessed against extinction. If it could not be the civilization of his dreams, it could at least be preserved against its enemies while he worked to improve it incrementally. This pragmatism extended to his relationship with the Imperial Creed. Guilliman personally does not believe the Emperor is a god, at least not in the conventional sense. He knew his father as a physical being, a human of extraordinary power, but still human, with human flaws and limitations. The deification that occurred after the Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne represents, in Guilliman's view, exactly the kind of superstitious regression his father sought to prevent. But he also recognizes that faith has power, quite literally in the 41st millennium. The Emperor's psychic presence, sustained by the worship of trillions, provides tangible benefits to the Imperium. The living saints who arise from the faithful are genuine supernatural phenomena, beings of power who fight for humanity. To dismantle the Imperial Creed would be to disarm the Imperium against its spiritual enemies. So Guilliman tolerates the religion he cannot share. He works alongside the ecclesiarchy when necessary, employs the Sisters of Battle in his campaigns, acknowledges the reality of miracles while maintaining his own skepticism about their ultimate source. It is an uncomfortable compromise, but compromise is what governance requires. His relationship with the Emperor remains the most complex and painful aspect of his existence. The meeting in the throne room left him shaken in ways he rarely acknowledges. He sought his father's wisdom and found something that might not have been wisdom at all, at least not in any human sense. He sought confirmation that his choices were correct, and received instead instructions that felt more like commands given to a weapon than advice offered to a son. Whether the Emperor truly sees Guilliman as merely a tool, or whether the Primarch's perception was distorted by the surreal nature of their communion, remains unclear. Some have suggested that the Emperor's manner reflects not callousness, but necessity, that after 10 millennia of sustaining the Astronomicon and holding back the forces of chaos, the master of mankind has simply lost the capacity for human warmth. Others wonder whether the Emperor ever possessed such warmth to begin with, whether the loving father Guilliman remembers was itself a performance designed to motivate a useful instrument. The uncertainty gnaws at Guilliman in quiet moments. He fights for an Imperium he finds morally repugnant, in service to a father who may never have truly loved him, against enemies who never tire and never stop. The burden of command permits no weakness, no public expression of doubt or despair. He must be the eternal optimist, the unfailing leader, the symbol of hope for a species drowning in darkness. This isolation defines his existence in ways few understand. Guilliman has no true peers in the current Imperium. The other loyalist Primarchs remain missing, or, like the recently returned Lionel Johnson, complicated in their own ways. The High Lords are politicians and bureaucrats, concerned with the mechanics of power rather than its purpose. The Space Marines revere him as something approaching divine, their devotion creating distance rather than connection. Only his equerry, Decimus Felix, and a handful of others have earned enough trust to see occasional glimpses of the man beneath the legend. And yet he continues. He rises each day, processes the reports and petitions, makes the decisions that will determine the fate of billions, and prepares for whatever crisis will next demand his attention. He does this not because he believes the Imperium deserves saving in its current form, but because the alternative, extinction, is worse. He does it because duty is not contingent on reward, because the right action remains right regardless of whether anyone will thank you for taking it. This is what makes Guilliman simultaneously admirable and tragic. He is the king who never wanted a crown, ruling an empire he cannot fix, fighting a war he cannot win, sustained only by the stubborn conviction that doing something is better than doing nothing. For 10,000 years, Guilliman was alone among the loyalist Primarchs, the only one of the Emperor's sons who remained active in the galaxy. The others had vanished in the aftermath of the heresy, disappeared into legend and rumour. Rogel Dawn was believed dead, only his hand recovered from the battlefield. Leman Russ had vanished into the Eye of Terror, seeking some mysterious purpose. Corvus Corax had departed into the warp, consumed by guilt over the failed Raptors project. Jagatai Khan had pursued fleeing Dark Eldar into the webway and never returned. Vulcan, as a perpetual, might survive somewhere, but he had not been seen in millennia. Then, unexpectedly, another returned. Lionel Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels, awoke from his own long slumber. The circumstances of his awakening differed from Guilliman's, where the Avenging Son had been. Preserved in technological stasis, the Lion had been held in some form of supernatural hibernation within a hidden chamber beneath the rock, the Dark Angels' fortress monastery. The Watchers in the Dark, those mysterious beings who had aided the Dark Angels since before the heresy, had preserved him for a purpose only now revealed. The relationship between Guilliman and the Lion was complex even before the heresy. The two Primarchs respected each other's capabilities, but approached problems very differently. Guilliman favoured systematic analysis and open collaboration. The Lion operated through secrets and misdirection, trusting no one completely. The Dark Angel's Primarch had an unsettling intensity that made many uncomfortable, and his methods often seemed unnecessarily mysterious to those who valued transparency. During the Imperium Secundus, these tensions had nearly erupted into open conflict. The Lion suspected Guilliman of harbouring imperial ambitions, of using the crisis to position himself as a replacement for the Emperor. Guilliman found the Lion's secretiveness frustrating and potentially dangerous. Only Sanguinius's calming influence had prevented the situation from deteriorating into violence. Now, 10 millennia later, they must somehow work together again. The Lion brings formidable military capability, his strategic genius second to none among the Primarchs in certain areas. He also brings the Dark Angels and their successor chapters, the so-called Unforgiven, whose loyalty to their Primarch exceeds even their considerable devotion to the Imperium. But he also brings complications. The Dark Angels harbour secrets that date back to the heresy, including the existence of the Fallen, those members of the Legion who turned traitor while the Lion was away at Caliban. The Unforgiven have spent 10,000 years hunting these traitors, sometimes at the expense of other duties, their obsession with redeeming their honour taking precedence over broader strategic considerations. How the two Primarchs will share authority remains to be seen. Guilliman holds the title of Imperial Regent and Lord Commander. He has been governing the Imperium for years, and has earned the allegiance of most of its institutions. The Lion accepts no subordination gladly. He served the Emperor directly and may view a younger brother's authority as presumption. The potential for conflict is substantial, even between two beings who share the same fundamental goals. For now, they cooperate. The threats facing the Imperium are too severe to permit internal division. Perhaps necessity will forge an alliance that history alone could not have produced. Perhaps their combined strength will accomplish what neither could achieve alone, or perhaps the fault lines that divided them during the heresy will reassert themselves, creating new crises at the worst possible moment. The future, as always, remains unwritten. As we near the end of our exploration, let us consider what Roboute Guilliman represents not merely to the Imperium but to the broader narrative of the Warhammer 40,000 setting. He is in many ways the audience's surrogate within the grimdark future. He looks upon the Imperium with the same horror that a reasonable person from our era would feel, seeing the oppression, the superstition, the endless suffering that characterizes human existence in the 41st millennium. His rationalist values align roughly with modern sensibilities. His despair at what humanity has become echoes the reader's own reaction to the setting's unrelenting darkness. But he is also a figure of compromise and complicity. He works within a system he finds abhorrent, enforcing policies he disagrees with, supporting institutions he believes to be fundamentally flawed. He does this because the alternative, allowing the Imperium to collapse, would mean humanity's extinction. The classic moral question, would you do terrible things to prevent something worse, finds its ultimate expression in Guilliman's dilemma. He cannot make the Imperium good, but he can perhaps prevent it from becoming worse. This tension gives him a depth that many 40k characters lack. He is not a zealot blind to the Imperium's flaws, nor a cynic who accepts them without protest. He struggles constantly with the gap between his ideals and his circumstances, trying to close that gap incrementally while acknowledging that complete success may be impossible. His is the tragedy of the reformer trapped within a system designed to resist reform. The burden he bears is quite literally superhuman. He does not sleep in any meaningful sense. His enhanced physiology permits him to function continuously for extended periods, and the demands of his position rarely allow for rest regardless. He processes more information in a day than most humans encounter in a lifetime, making decisions that affect trillions of lives, often with incomplete data and under severe time pressure. The emotional toll of such responsibility would shatter an ordinary mind within hours. That he has endured this burden for years since his resurrection, with millennia more stretching ahead if he survives, speaks to something in his character that transcends mere genetic enhancement. Some might call it will, others duty, others simple stubbornness. Whatever its name, it is the quality that makes him essential to the Imperium's survival, even as it slowly consumes him from within. There is also something deeply poignant about his isolation. He is surrounded constantly by people, by advisors and petitioners and warriors and servants, yet he has no equals. No one fully understands what he experiences. No one can share the particular loneliness of being the only being of his kind attempting to hold together a crumbling civilization. Even the lion, for all his returned presence, cannot truly comprehend what Guilliman has endured alone. This isolation extends to his relationship with his own sons, the Ultramarines. They revere him as something approaching divine, their devotion so intense that it creates an unbridgeable distance. Guilliman cannot confide his doubts and fears to beings who believe him incapable of doubt or fear. He must maintain the mask of confidence even when confidence fails him, projecting the strength that others need to see regardless of what he actually feels. The armour of fate that he wears serves as a physical metaphor for his situation. It sustains him, yes, but it also confines him. He cannot remove it without dying. The wounds Fulgrim inflicted remain, held at bay but not healed. He is imprisoned within his salvation, preserved by a cage he can never escape. What awaits Roboute Guilliman as the 42nd millennium unfolds? The honest answer is uncertainty. The threats facing the Imperium have not diminished. If anything, they continue to multiply. The Great Rift remains open, vomiting forth chaos incursions without end. The Tyranid hive fleets consume their way toward the galaxy's heart. The Necrons awaken in ever greater numbers, their ancient dynasties stirring to reclaim dominions lost 60 million years ago. The Orcs gather for wars that could devastate entire sectors. Yet there are reasons for hope, if not optimism. The Primaris Marines have proven their worth, providing the Imperium with military capabilities it sorely lacked. The return of the Lion doubles the number of active loyalist Primarchs, and whispers persist that others may yet awaken. The Imperium has survived the initial crisis of the Great Rift and stabilised to some degree, demonstrating a resilience that many had thought lost. Guilliman himself continues to work toward reform, however incrementally. He has revised the Codex Astartes, eliminating restrictions that proved counterproductive. He has established new institutions like the Codex Imperialis to improve governance throughout imperial space. He has forged alliances, however awkward, with former enemies like the Inari when circumstances demanded it. He plants seeds that may take centuries to bear fruit, trusting that his vision will outlive any individual setback. The relationship between Guilliman and the imperial cult remains unresolved. He has not moved to dismantle the ecclesiarchy or disavow the worship of the emperor, recognizing both the practical difficulties and the genuine power that faith provides. Whether this accommodation will prove sustainable in the long term, or whether the fundamental contradiction will eventually force a crisis, remains to be seen. His own spiritual state has evolved since the Plague Wars. The manifestation of the Emperor's power through him during the confrontation with Mortarion raised questions that his rationalist framework struggles to answer. If divine intervention is real, if the Emperor truly acts through agents like living saints, and apparently through Guilliman himself, what does that mean for his understanding of the universe? Some have suggested that Guilliman is slowly coming to accept what he once would have rejected, that his father, whatever he was before, has become something that might reasonably be called a god. The definition of deity in a universe where psychic power is demonstrably real and belief shapes reality is not what it would be in a purely materialist cosmos. Perhaps the Imperial Creed is not merely superstition, but an accurate, if primitive, recognition of genuine supernatural phenomena. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the Emperor remains what he always was, a human of extraordinary power whose followers have misunderstood his nature. Perhaps what seems like divine intervention is merely the operation of psychic forces that do not require deification to explain. The ambiguity is intentional, part of the setting's refusal to provide definitive answers to its deepest questions. What is certain is that Guilliman will continue to fight. He will continue to govern, to reform, to push back against the darkness however he can. He will bear the burden of kingship because no one else can bear it, because the alternative is to let everything fall. He will be the Space King of mankind for as long as humanity needs him, which is to say, for as long as he survives. The future is unwritten. But in the grim darkness of the far future, one light still burns. Not the golden radiance of the Emperor, entombed and silent upon his throne, but the colder, steadier flame of duty embraced and purpose maintained. The light of a son who returned from death to find his father's dream in ruins and chose to rebuild rather than despair. The light of Roboute Guilliman. So we come to the end of our journey through the life and legacy of Roboute Guilliman, though his story continues and will continue for as long as Games Workshop keeps producing content for this setting we all love. We have walked the forests of Macragge, where a child of gold descended from the stars to be raised by a noble consul who dreamed of greatness. We have marched alongside the Ultramarines during the Great Crusade, watching as Guilliman built not just a legion but an empire, not just an army but a civilization. We have stood amid the ruins of Calth, witnessing treachery so profound that its echoes still resonate 10,000 years later. We have seen him rise and fall and rise again. We have seen him make choices that defined the Imperium's future, for better and for worse. We have seen him struggle with doubts that would shatter lesser beings, bearing the weight of responsibility that no single individual should ever have to carry. And we have seen him refuse to break. That refusal, more than any military victory or administrative achievement, is what defines Roboute Guilliman. He is the Primarch who would not surrender to despair. He is the leader who maintained hope when hope seemed impossible. He is the son who serves an empire he finds abhorrent because the alternative, abandoning billions to extinction, is unthinkable. Is he a hero? The question resists easy answers. He has done terrible things in service to terrible purposes. The Imperium he sustains is not a force for good by any conventional moral standard. It is a necessary evil at best, a monument to humanity's worst impulses at worst. But within the context of the setting, within the constraints imposed by the 41st Millennium's unrelenting grimdark reality, he is perhaps the closest thing to a protagonist the Imperium possesses. He is the Space King of mankind, not because he wanted the crown, not because he believes himself worthy of it, but because someone must wear it and no one else can bear the weight. If this exploration of Guilliman's lore has enriched your understanding of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, please consider supporting the channel by liking this video and subscribing if you have not already done so. The Obsidian Scriptorium will continue to delve into the depths of the far future, uncovering stories and lore that illuminate the grim darkness in which humanity fights for survival. Until next time, remember, in the far future there is only war. But even in war, there are those who fight not for conquest, but for something more. Those who hold the line not because victory is assured, but because defeat is unacceptable. Those who carry the light into the darkness, knowing it may be extinguished at any moment, refusing to let it die. The Emperor protects, but sometimes protection requires a sword in hand and a Primarch to wield it. Avi Imperator, and thank you for watching.